Good afternoon. My name is Natalie Curry and I'm General Manager for Supply Chains at the ARA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the official launch of ARA's latest major research report, the Australian Rail Supply Chain. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm really delighted to be launching our new research report today on the critical role of the Australian supply chain in delivering the $155 billion of rail investment over the next 15 years. Yet concerningly, the future health and long-term sustainability of the rail supply chain is at a critical juncture due to the numerous well-known legacy issues which impact the local supply chain's ability to scale up, innovate, increase efficiency, and effectively compete. Now, rail construction over the next 5 years alone will be more than double than what we saw at the peak of the mining boom. Industry and government really need to appropriately plan and prepare for this, so Australia can actually reap the benefits that is necessary and for this major investment. Renewed considerations around supply chain resilience and the need for local economic stimulus brought about by COVID-19 provides a significant opportunity to drive change and improvements. The research included an extensive survey of all organisations involved in the rail supply chain and several deep dive workshops with industry to understand the barriers and opportunities that exist and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the rail supply chain. Today's report gives a number of recommendations to address the barriers and maximise the opportunities so that the rail supply chain can not just survive but thrive in continuing to deliver major investment projects around the country to ensure we bounce back from the economic effects of COVID-19. The delivery of the report is just the beginning. The ARA is now actually developing a supply chain blueprint in consultation with industry, which will prioritise and outline the practical steps required to deliver against these recommendations, which call for a partnership approach across many of the key areas. You'll identify in the report from procurement reform, skills development, innovation and technology, investment and funding, sustainability, and promoting the industry. I really look forward to keeping you informed on the progress around this development of the blueprint. We have a packed agenda today. To get the conversation started, we'll firstly have a report from the author, Adrian Hart, from BIS Oxford Economics, and Adrian will provide an overview of the report's key findings. After that, we have an impressive panel of industry leaders for a Q&A session to hear firsthand about their experiences on the ground and how we can bring new opportunities to life in the future. If you would like to submit a question at any time, please go to the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen and enter your questions there. We will hope to get through as many as possible in the time we have. So, onto the report's findings. I'm really pleased to introduce Adrian Hart, who's the Associate Director for Construction and Infrastructure at BIS Oxford Economics, to provide an overview of the report released today. Adrian has nearly 20 years of economic analysis and consulting experience with BIS Oxford Economics, focusing on the infrastructure, building, maintenance and mining industries. It's fantastic to have Adrian with us today, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the screen. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks everyone for joining in today. I'd like to thank the ARA for letting us work on another exciting project in the rail industry. I'm the head of construction and infrastructure at BIS Oxford Economics, and I can tell you that rail is actually the most exciting industry sector going forward over the next 5 years, let alone the next decade. And while there's a lot of industry challenges that I'm going to talk through when we discuss the report, at a macro level, it has a real opportunity to play a big role in the way Australia recovers from the COVID-19 recession that we had in 2020 and how we'll continue to sustain economic growth and jobs well into the future. And so there's a bit of a combination of challenges that we're facing here, both at a microeconomic level and a macro level. But I think the rail is a very interesting place to be, certainly over the next 5 years. We could just move to the next slide. In terms of my presentation today, I want to talk you through a little bit about what we set out to do with the rail supply chain project and report. I'll talk a little bit more about that outlook that we see for rail in Australia. And then we'll get into what some of the key findings were that came out of the report. In particular, what was the impact of COVID-19? What were the other big challenges that industry revealed when we did many surveys and interviews and came to a lot of the conclusions that are in the report? And then I want to talk you through the most critical elements of the report, and that's the 9 action areas that we identified and 39 recommendations for industry. And I hope and wish Natalie and the ARA well and the rail industry well in how they respond to these recommendations and really set up an action blueprint for reform. Next slide. In terms of the supply chain project, look, there was actually a lot of things we wanted to capture. We actually provided an evidence report to the ARA, as well as a dashboard in Power BI that grabbed a lot of information about what we know about the supply chain, but had never consolidated in a single spot. So things like the number and size of firms, the types of products and services they offer, the level of Australian ownership. We really wanted to try and understand how important the local supply chain is to the rail industry and how much we rely on our global connections as well. But we also wanted to answer some of those questions, things like what was the impact of COVID-19? What was it mostly negative? Were there benefits? And also, what were the other challenges? And what do we really need to do to have a sustainable rail supply chain in the future? Next slide. This is an example of some of the Power BI analytics that we developed as part of the report. In fact, there's over 1,200 rail supply firms make up part of the supply chain. And look, many supply a range of infrastructure sectors not specific to rail. And some may not even consider themselves primarily a rail supplier. But there are many firms that are dedicated to the rail industry as well. And what we've tried to do is set up a range of dashboard information that the ARA can tap into and in future expand upon to try and get more information about what is the supply chain, what are they doing, and where are they located. Next slide. From the Deloitte Access Economics report that the ARA released last year, we certainly know it's a big enough industry, providing a value of about $30 billion a year to the Australian economy and over 165,000 jobs. Now, that includes more than just the construction of big rail projects that we tend to focus on a lot. There's a huge element to the supply chain that is involved in much broader activities, right through from manufacturing and design to operations, maintenance, and so forth. So the actual construction side of the story often gets the attention and notice, but it's actually more important that we focus on the upstream and downstream activities of rail that actually provide a lot of the permanent jobs in the rail industry. Next slide. When we undertook this mapping exercise, as I said, there's over 1,200 firms. We were able to map about 400 businesses as part of this project. We'd like to continue to expand on this and continue to flesh out the supply chain. Our initial efforts have shown, however, there is quite a concentration on the East Coast in terms of where the supply chain is located. But importantly, every single state and territory of Australia has quite a significant rail business in there. And so whether it's an upstream supplier or an operator or another part of the downstream part of the industry or construction contractors, they're located right over the country. Next slide. And that sort of puts to rest the idea necessarily that this is just a Sydney, a Melbourne, or a New South Wales and Victorian or Queensland industry. It's actually a national industry. And I'll come back to this later, but it's important that we are sustainable at a national level. Too many times we think of things in terms of local content policies or trying to derive local benefits. That tends to ignore just how national the footprint is and how hard it is to sustain large enough businesses within just set defined boundaries. The point is that every state has a stake in this, every territory has a stake in this, And if we can get the reforms right, if we can get the supply chain working well and sustainably, then all states will benefit from it. Next slide. This is what I was talking about before about construction. I mean, when we surveyed a lot of firms, there's more firms that are involved in the maintenance side of the equation than necessarily the construction side in our surveys. And certainly there's a lot more upstream work and jobs that, are part of the important part of the rail industry than just, just the construction phase alone. And so we've looked at all phases when we're considering this supply chain report. The construction wave is important, but what's more important is the legacy it leaves for maintenance, operations, and ongoing jobs into the future. Next slide. Apologies. I'm just coming back. Slight internet issue. Apologies for that. A few things about the supply chain. One of the important things that we discovered from surveys was how strong actually revenues were growing for many rail supply businesses in recent years because of the pipeline of work which has already begun. And importantly, a lot of firms feel that they're in a very strong position to be able to capitalise on the growth coming through if they're given enough time to gear up for the demand. Next slide. And what a demand profile it looks like. Now, these charts can be misleading. I mean, often we tend to find that these projects tend to be a bit smoother than necessarily what they're rolled out, but this is currently how all the states and territories and the federal government is rolling out some of its really big projects, as well as the private sector. And what you can see here is that nearly every state and territory is investing over the next 5 years and in some very large, complex projects, including tunnels, a lot of regional work as well with inland rail, metros, passenger rails, and freight and so forth, and heavy haul. So all sectors are really driving this, and it's a huge amount of investment. Now, the downside is that we may not see that downside as it's played out. These are just the projects that we know about at this point in time. But as we go through the coming decade, there'll be likely to be more projects as well of very large nature that will sustain activity at much higher levels than we've seen in the past. And this is actually a really big opportunity for the local supply chain. Next slide. In fact, here's some of those longer term projections that we derive at BIS Oxford Economics and we forecast. Essentially, we see a long period of high levels of investment. And in part, this is a correction for substantially weak investment during much of the 80s and 90s and 2000s before the resources boom. We saw a lot of resource-related investment, and now we're seeing actually the flip side. We're seeing a lot of passenger and freight-related investment because we haven't kept up. The challenge is that we don't necessarily want to have these big cycles in future. I'd love to see a very smooth pipeline going ahead. But currently, under current plans, certainly there's a strong uplift in rail construction we're expecting over the next few years. A near doubling, as Natalie mentioned, of investment that we saw during the resources boom. Next slide. I talk about the macro influence of the rail industry. It's huge because what we've seen in Australia is actually the biggest recession for over 70 years. The word unprecedented gets used a lot. It's not quite unprecedented, but to anyone with the living memory right now, it certainly is. We saw a 7% collapse in the Australian economy in the June quarter. We've seen quite a strong recovery, really, and over the last 2 quarters, we've had growth rates above 3% per quarter. Now, that's not going to be sustained long term. A lot of this reflects just bounce back from lockdowns and restrictions as we've managed to control the health consequences of the virus. But we need something that will sustain growth longer term. And certainly rail offers an opportunity as part of programs of investment in the economy that can sustain growth and jobs longer term that we're going to need. Next slide. again, just highlighting just what a cycle we've been through. We're coming out now of a very bottom part, you'd say, of global, or should say national GDP and industrial production. We've got a very strong recovery in prospect. But some of the things that COVID-19 has impacted are going to stick with us a little bit longer. One is the trouble that we have, of course, we don't have an open border. And a lot of our population growth has come through that avenue of net overseas migration. But we see net overseas migration going negative, i.e. more people leaving the country, of course, than arriving. That's going to have a substantial impact on our population. We believe that population will be about 600,000 people less in Australia over the next 5 years compared to what we were thinking pre-pandemic. But also longer term, it may take a while for that population growth to snap back. Now that drives demand for infrastructure, but it's also a key source of skills as well for the rail industry. And some of the challenges of people and the movement of people has really come through in the skills study that we prepared for this project. The supply chain study we prepared for this project, showing how people and getting access to skills state by state certainly was one of the highest rating challenges that the supply chain faced. Next slide. So in terms of COVID-19, that was skills. I mean, actually, when we did the surveys and the interviews with a lot of businesses, initially people were reporting challenges with deliveries through the global supply chain. And then the biggest challenge became, well, actually, how do we get access to skills? Without open borders, we can't get people moving around from New South Wales into Queensland, into Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and so on. And this became one of the critical concerns, along with the lower patronage, of course, that we saw on a lot of our passenger networks. And we've got not just commuter and freight and other sort of services, but some of the most impacted, of course, were some of those littler rail businesses that operate tourist railways, which absolutely saw their demand absolutely get crunched by COVID-19. Overall, however, the supply chain reported holding up really well, and many people reported an almost business as usual kind of situation after some of the initial adjustment phase. Next slide. Pardon me. In fact, a lot of people actually reported during the surveys and interviews for this supply chain report many benefits of COVID-19. For instance, the way that we've all adapted to using new technologies like we're doing now with Zoom meetings, webinars, in the rail space and in manufacturing and so on, the idea of using Google Glass and other virtual reality sort of technologies to assist with training and inspections and so forth. We also saw an accelerated path towards data analytics and using intelligence tools than pre-COVID. Surprisingly, a lot of firms reported that the health of their employees was actually better during COVID-19 than otherwise would be the case, because not only did we stop the spread of COVID, but by increasing our hygiene, wiping down tools, benches, and generally using a lot of sanitizer and cleaning, we've been able to keep a lot of other viruses at bay as well. But I will say there's a couple of really big long-term impacts that I think are going to benefit the rail industry from COVID-19. And one is that it's really put a focus on where we get our supplies from. When people are shocked to think about how concentrated their supply may be from a particular region or country or company, now people are thinking very seriously about where they're getting their supplies from, what sort of risks there are. And this is actually a huge opportunity for the Australian local industry to tap into. The other big thing I see with the rail industry is that I think it's probably able to attract a more diverse range of talent because of COVID-19. We're moving to a more flexible kind of workplace in many places, in and outside the rail industry. And I think this will favour people that have more diverse requirements, and generally that would be hoped for, because at the moment the rail industry does suffer from having perhaps not as diverse a workforce as what it could. Next slide. But apart from COVID-19, we identified a range of real challenges that the supply chain faces if it's to have a sustainable future in Australia. And when you boil it all down to it, it really comes down to having scale. We've got a lot of features about our rail industry, just the way it's developed in Australia, which are preventing the appropriate building of scale that allows us to really build well and high quality to the point that we can supply global markets. I've grouped these here in across these various groupings with legacy issues, things like the way we've built our rail network over the past 100+ years. Certainly, it's not just the systems and gauges and things like that that are very different, but also hence the retraining requirements and the integration requirements and the regulation. The policy issues, the way we fund rail, the way we procure it, often doesn't lend itself to innovation, and it doesn't give us the best possible chance to improving productivity outcomes and building world-class technologies that we can export to the rest of the world. And so that's another group that I'd like to focus on as part of this supply chain report. And finally, there's a matter of how you actually do it, how you coordinate change and reform and just coordinate our industry. At the moment, it's very difficult to get national leadership with the rail industry, and I find that unfortunate. But there are other ways of achieving our goals, and how we collaborate between government, between industry is going to be very important, because we need a level of consistency in the way that we procure, plan for, deliver, operate, maintain our rail networks, if we're really going to achieve the kind of scale that we want to achieve for the supply chain to make it sustainable. Next slide. So in our report, we took a lot of this feedback and we did a lot of research, and we've basically tried to nut it out into the 9 key action areas. And they are action areas. They are areas where we've got to do something and we need to make a move. Now, we've come up with about 39 recommendations that fit within these action areas. But again, it all comes down to trying to create scale, trying to create quality that will allow the supply chain to flourish and not just supply the Australian market more, but also offer technologies and services and products that we can consider ourselves proud about on a global scale. Just going through it, you can see it seems a lot, but actually they're all highly interlinked. And later on in the panel session, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how interlinked they are, and probably what we should be kicking on with to make some really strong gains. But generally, it's all about achieving those common objectives, reforming how we procure projects. I think those are highly critical and offer actually some pretty strong opportunity over the next few years, given the scale of the rollout that's being planned. But also we need to look at our local content policies better. We need to plan for our skills. We need to look at the way we regulate our rail networks. We need to boost innovation. The ARA has already released a great report on how to boost innovation, so I'm not going to talk too much on that, only to say that if we get a lot of these other things right, particularly around procurement and local content policies, then we can actually provide an environment which will be supportive of innovation. We also want to promote the capabilities of our supply chain a lot better. I mean, there are some fantastic stories that the Australian rail industry has to tell about solving problems, using lightweight materials, working in extreme temperatures. We've come up with some great engineering solutions and fantastic IP. And yet we need to be telling these stories more on a global scale so that we can demonstrate our capabilities. Often we get a lot of procurement that is offshored, and they tend to use their own companies that they're familiar with. Well, we need to sort of start breaking down that nexus and recognise the actual achievements of our local industry. Finally, it's all about sustainability, and there's two big issues here to think about. One is, how do we sustainably fund rail investment? How do we sustain financials in the rail industry? But there's also that environmental aspect as well. And the Deloitte Access Economics report earlier that I mentioned highlighted the strong environmental credentials that rail has in Australia. This is important to consider longer term, but there's a lot more that the rail industry can be doing to improve its environmental credentials and actually fulfill being part of a circular economy. So I want to take these apart just step by step over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Then hopefully there's some time for some questions, or we'll move into a panel session to discuss it. But next slide, please. So achieving the common objectives, this is actually, it sounds easy, it's proved hard. We want really jurisdictions across Australia, that's all the state-by-state governments, the national government, to really start looking at having some common frameworks and goals, looking at the way they consistently publish rail pipelines, and really commit to what Infrastructure Australia is promoting in its priority recommendations. There's a whole range of things here that we really need greater coordination on. And the big challenge is, do we achieve that sort of through a national mechanism, or can we achieve it through a kind of a piecemeal approach through all the states? And I'll be happy to talk about that later, but there's certainly pros and cons with both approaches. Next slide. Procurement, I believe, actually offers some of the greatest gains that we might be able to make, because there is so much that is going to be procured over the next 5 years. Really huge levels of investment we're anticipating, and then sustained levels of investment for a strong period of time after that. Now, we can use this procurement well. We can use the power of dollars, in a sense, to guide how we do things better. We can do things better in procurement. We often don't choose the right kind of procurement model. We've often got some very inconsistent contracts that are used around the country. We should be trying to bring in the full scope of the supply chain where we can, but recognise too that there are some very strong leaders in our rail industry as well. Ideally, I'd like to see the development of a register of rail businesses in Australia that's very clear, so that procurers and the rest of the industry gets a strong sense of who is out there, because I fear that so many firms get overlooked because their capabilities are overlooked. And we certainly have quite a depth of skill to the Australian industry that many may not know. Next slide. Here's a big one, local content policy reform. Now, it is a big part of how we're procuring rail projects at the moment, and I'll argue the point in this report that it's probably not the best way. Yes, there's an interest in state governments to try and secure benefits for their own state. It's often state governments that are funding these rail projects, really large ones, in their metros and light rails, and even some of the freight projects. But really, we've got to look at local content and consider local content at a more national level. We've had some bad stories really out of the supply chain project, where we've seen companies in some states disadvantaged just by the fact they're just over the border to be able to work for projects in another state. And we really shouldn't be trying to disqualify Australian businesses for working on Australian projects. That to me is a very inefficient way of running a rail procurement program. Next slide. Regulation. Now here there's a range of things that we can discuss and talk about changing. It's really about how do we do things better, and how do we sort of harmonise that regulation across industry. Now, we've mentioned a few recommendations here in the report, such as reducing time it takes to achieve accreditations, reducing the type approvals, process duplication that we see, trying to actually improve the efficiency of this process where it might be holding things up. But we also want to support those broader policy reforms in industry that can give greater consistency, really, as to how we regulate our rail industry across the nation. One of the things that came out of the supply chain study was that a lot of firms, especially firms from overseas that want to be part of the Australian rail industry, view Australia as like 8 different countries, or 13 when you consider all the sub-markets within each state sometimes. And that's not a very efficient way of sustaining scale and hence sustainability of the rail industry. Next slide. Innovation. Now, I said I wouldn't talk too much about this, but if we get a lot of the other things right, the innovation can follow. What we really need to do is provide an incentive for firms to innovate, to use new technologies, to do things differently. And I must say that in our procurement processes many times, and this also came through in many of the interviews and surveys for this study, we don't give that opportunity to innovate. We just like doing things the way they've always been done. And sometimes it's a very mechanical way of doing it. It may be a very old-fashioned way of doing it, but it means that we're not necessarily driving strong productivity gains in the way that we deliver projects, and we're not developing new IP. And at the moment, there's many avenues for driving a sustainable supply chain. One is that we can become better at sort of banging the bits of metal together, as some people have said in the supply chain study. But perhaps more importantly, we can become a lot better at developing engineering know-how and IP. And that's how we're going to drive really strong, sustainable growth in the Australian industry. Next slide. Promotion. I mean, we've done a lot of work in the rail sector, and I must say that rail sometimes thinks of itself as having a bit of an image problem. But there's one thing worse than thinking you've got an image problem, and that is not having an image at all. And in many cases, we see that Australian firms may be overlooked because there's simply not an awareness of the capabilities and skills and the abilities that these firms have to deliver. So what we'd like to see is a lot more action taken to promote the Australian rail supply chain, their capabilities, make them visible, not just to local industry, but globally as well. And that's really how we're going to achieve longer-term sustainability of the industry. So it's not just supplying an Australian market, which is, at the end of the day, just a small market compared to the rest of the world. We want to be able to build businesses that can supply bigger, and hence we really need to have that global reach in our thinking. Next slide. Skills. Now, the skills issue hasn't gone away. We still have shortages of skills in the rail industry. We're rolling out a lot of very large, complex projects over the next 5 years, a lot of brownfields, a lot of interfaces, a lot of tunnels. We look at signalling, electrical engineers, tunnellers, a whole range of civil expertise. And that's just on the construction side. When you step back from that and look at the rest of the supply chain, this drives a whole range of skills that we need in manufacturing, for rolling stock, for equipment, for building materials and construction materials, but also down the track when we operate these facilities as well, and new assets and how we maintain them, and doing that as efficiently as we can. We still have a big skills issue because of all our different fragmented sort of markets state by state. It's very hard to move people around compared to what it should be. And as a consequence, we can have severe skills shortages in some states just because we don't have people with the requisite knowledge and capability on those particular assets that they might have. Now, we actually prepared a report for the ARA 2 years ago on the skills crisis, and that hasn't left. And a lot of the recommendations in that report really do flow through here, that we've really got to value training. We've got to value it rather than just thinking of it as a cost. But we also need ways to harmonise this training and make it easy to get into so that we get the skills as we're going to need it, because it's a big pipeline we've got coming up. Next slide. Finally, the last two points of the report where I believe that action is really required is looking at sustainability. It is a big cycle that we've got coming up, and it hasn't happened by accident. And it hasn't happened as a response even to the COVID-19 recession. It's happened because governments have made decisions in the main to invest in rail, and to do that, they've had to work out how to fund and finance them. And it involved a lot of asset sales in the case of New South Wales and Victoria, to provide the kind of funding that is needed to develop assets such as metros, for instance. Now, unfortunately, if we were to rely on governments purely to fund a lot of our rail infrastructure through traditional means, through the budget, you'd likely get very cyclical sort of funding mechanisms. And what we want to do is actually get away from that, because when you have a cyclical funding mechanism, a lot of revenues that rise when the economy is going good and then cuts out when the economy is going bad, you get very cyclical investment decisions. And what we need less of in the rail industry is cycles. What we need is strong, sustained, sort of long-term investment, growing over time to meet population freight demands. And so that means we need to rethink the way we fund our rail longer term, so that we have a kind of a funding mechanism that matches that, rather than offers a cyclical kind of solution. Next slide. Finally, longer term, the environment is making is going to be, even more important than what it is now. Before we had COVID-19, of course, we had bushfires, and that woke up a lot of people to global warming. Now, that argument, it hasn't gone away. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to continue to go down the path towards a net sort of zero carbon emission sort of economy. And, it'll make economic sense to do that. The new energies that are being developed in renewables and hydrogen, these offer very strong, low cost and affordable energy, and the rail industry will need to move along with them. And so there's an element here that we're going to need to continue to work on rail, because it does have strong environmental benefits compared to road transport. So we'll need to continue to invest in ways that we can continue to have a low carbon sort of emission rail network. But the other key feature of this is that as we're investing in this next wave of rail projects, there's going to be a lot of assets that are going to move offline as well. We're going to be replacing, for instance, a lot of rolling stock. I'd love to see in the next wave of investment that we start looking seriously at the circular economy and how we improve the way that we reuse, recycle existing assets. Certainly the interviews that we had in the rail industry shows that it can be done. There are many parts of our rail industry, and old wagons, for instance, and locos, that can be recycled and reused. This is going to be an ongoing development for the industry, but it's going to be so important if we're to improve our environmental performance. Next slide. So those are the 9 key action areas that we see. As I said, we do think they're highly linked, and I think if we do make progress on some, it will naturally lead to strong progress on others. I just want to leave you by saying that COVID-19 has actually unleashed a huge opportunity for reform. And how many times I've heard over the past year that we shouldn't waste a crisis. Well, this has been a crisis, and I certainly hope it won't get wasted, because there's a strong opportunity ahead for rail. There's a strong opportunity ahead for the local supply chain. And if anything, COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of having strong local supply skills. It's highlighted the importance of where we're getting things from a global supply chain perspective. And what we should be doing now is taking advantage of that huge opportunity, because the cost, if we don't, is very large. There is a huge pipeline that is coming through in Australia and even more so around the rest of the world. And we can really tap into that a lot more and a lot more powerfully than we've done to date. And so really we need to prioritize these actions now. We need to really come up with some serious look at who's going to do it, how we're going to do it, because we're already starting to roll out the next wave of projects. And there's a lot of jobs on the line if we get this right, and a lot of businesses that can look to a very strong, sustainable future if we get it right. And I also think, just in finishing up, that in this there is a strong role for the ARA to help coordinate the development of this action plan, and I certainly look forward to the ARA as it develops its blueprint as a response to this report. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Adrian. That was great. Really insightful summary, and thanks so much for all the work you've done on the report. Join me back on screen. I've got a couple of questions that have come through. One you've sort of touched on in your last slide around next steps and what do we do in terms of prioritization. You've highlighted a number of challenges, 39 recommendations, 9 areas, and whilst we need to do some prioritizing and planning, do you have a personal view, I guess, of where the key priorities are, of where we should start?
Look, as I said earlier in the presentation, I look at the wave that's coming through, and I think we've already made some sort of progress here, but there's so much more we could be doing on the procurement side of the equation. These are the things that are going to hit us pretty soon. We're seeing really big projects being rolled out over the next 2 years. In New South Wales and Victoria, at the high level of government, there is a recognition that we do procure things pretty badly sometimes, and that governments are making some sort of efforts to rethink that sort of procurement, change the risk equation, think a little bit more about how to incentivize innovation in the way that we procure and how to support the supply chain. I think we can make some really strong gains early on if we can try and bring other states and territories into that sort of mindset, and then try to achieve a sort of common standard that we can look to procure rail projects on in future. It'll obviously help the next wave, but if we get it right, it'll mean that the future for rail industry procurement will be a lot stronger than what it has been. And hopefully that will lead to pretty strong innovation and support for our local supply chain.
That's great. Yes, Adrian, lots to do, but it needs to be in partnership. Now, I've had a question that's come through online that was a specific query around one of the graphs that you put up. So here's the challenge. We might need to take this one offline, but oh, look, Cindy's amazing. She's just pulled it up. The question was around the overseas column at the end of the graph. Does that overseas mean Australian companies supplying overseas or overseas companies supplying to Australia?
It was mainly companies that weren't based in a particular state or territory, but had their head office sort of based overseas. And so there are a lot of firms that actually have head offices overseas. Actually, I think that was looking more at who'd also established an office in Australia as well, but were linked to that head office overseas. So yes, we're an international business in rail, of course, and certainly don't want to distract from that. But there's actually a lot of businesses that operate off our own bats in each state and territory of Australia was the main point of that slide.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Adrian. I'd now like to bring all our other panellists to the screen to join Adrian. So firstly, we're joined by Michael McClellan, who has been the Managing Director of Knorr-Bremse in Australia since 2004. Michael is the current chair of ARA's Rail Industry Group and has been an ARA director since 2018. Welcome, Michael. I'm also pleased to welcome Raphael. She is the CEO of Australia and New Zealand at Siemens Mobility. Raphael joined Siemens in 2011 and has held various roles, including the head of projects for Singapore and the head of tendering for ASEAN Pacific. Prior to this, she was also with Alstom in Singapore, so lots of international experience. Welcome, Raphael. We're also joined by Treven Martinez. He is the CEO of Martinez Rail, and Treven has led the growth of the organisation over the last 15 years to become the largest Australian-owned self-performing railway construction company in Australia. Congratulations, Treven. Treven is also the member of ARA's Rail Contractors Group. And Andrew is joining us now, hopefully. Andrew Lazala, he is the chair of Inva Engineering and managing director of Lazala Consulting. Andrew is a business leader and engineer with 44 years experience in rail. Andrew's past roles include being president of Bombardier Transportation Global Services Division and CEO of Metro Trains Melbourne. Andrew is also a member of the ARA's Rail Industry Group. Welcome all. Thank you so much for your time. Just a reminder to those online, please send through your questions, post them in the control panel, and we'll do our best to get through them in the time we have. So let's kick off. Who wants to be my first guinea pig? Michael, I'm going to throw to you. We've heard about the significant investment in rail that's happening over the next 15 years, 155 billion. That's a colossal amount of money. What are the opportunities that are being created at the different stages in the rail supply chain as a result of this sort of investment? And what action do we really need to ensure that we can realise these opportunities? Michael, I'll just get you to take yourself off mute. Try again.
Unmuted. Sorry, I've worked Perfect. It out. Yeah, enormous opportunities coming up from a subsystem supplier or a tier 2 supplier. The key issue for us is being able to manage these huge opportunities through the cycle. And as Adrian said, there's a lot coming, but from a procurement point of view, it's really important that we get good transparency of what's coming up so we can see what we need to gear up for, if you like. But also we need stability. I mean, one of the problems we often have is we gear up, we slow down, we gear up, we slow down within projects or from one project to another. So I think one of the most important things from a supplier perspective is not only to have the the vision and the transparency of what projects are coming, but we need stability. And it's no good building a whole lot of stuff for one project, then it stops for 12 months and then extensions start 12 months later. These are the issues that really cause problems in the supply chain in terms of being able to prosecute, very large, programs like we see coming up.
Yeah. That's great, Michael. Andrew, it's so great for you to join us. The question was around in terms of investment in rail, and there's such a significant amount in the coming years, but how do we seize these opportunities? I wondered if you wanted to add to that.
Well, I think that Adrian mentioned scale, and I think we've certainly got scale now going forward. So the opportunity is to try and take full advantage of that in a way that allows us to really leave a legacy in the industry. Now that won't happen unless we tackle the really, I think, the key priorities from this report in terms of getting our localization policy right nationally, as the report recommends, making sure the skills are there to support the works that we need to do, and which will mean, as Adrian was mentioning, not just looking after our big apprentice programs, graduate programs, getting more people in Australia interested in this industry, but also and retraining people who are in industries that are not doing so well, but also addressing the immigration issues and making it easy to get the right people into the country, the right people with specialist skills that we don't have here in the right quantities. So those things need to be tackled. And in the areas that one of my areas of interest, as you know, is metros. I think there's a tremendous opportunity at the moment to create more standardization across the country and making sure that the metros that we've already established, like the Northwest in Sydney, becomes a bit of a blueprint, as happened in Hong Kong and to some extent in Singapore, where you start to get pretty standard vehicle approach in terms of dimensions, power supplies, signaling systems, whatever, so that we can really create that scale and not reinvent the wheel in a different state. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to use this huge investment to start trying to get more standardization. And it's not easy, but you can certainly standardize on many fronts and getting the skills to support it. And that needs national coordination. I think ARA and the politician, we need to lobby the politicians really on all fronts to be able to get some advantage out of this. And if you then look at the technologies that we could develop, I mean, the automotive industry is showing us how you can make a decision. We're not going to have internal combustion engines after 20 whatever. We have a tremendous opportunity in Australia to become leaders in hydrogen technology. We've got enough renewable energy to be able to create hydrogen fuel supplies. And if we took the decision nationally that we're gonna have hydrogen fueled trains by 2030, then that changes the whole dynamics, and it puts us in a world leading position to take advantage of a huge overseas market that is going to come. So that's just one example of an opportunity to switch technologies if we can coordinate this investment. That was a bit long-winded, sorry.
No, I appreciate that, Andrew. Rafael, you probably agree with Andrew around the sort of lack of standardization and fragmentation of the industry being sort of underlying many of these barriers for industry. How can we achieve greater harmonization in your view? I'll just get you to take yourself off mute. No, that didn't work. Cindy, can you assist? Treven, I might throw to you while we're working out Rafael's sound.
Okay.
You're obviously an advocate around national approaches, I think particularly probably to standards and procurement from your experience. How do you think a national approach can really reduce costs for industry and increase efficiencies?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Nat. There's two opportunities there with a national approach. One's on the procurement front and one's on the skills front. So I'll tackle the second one first. Andrew mentioned about a skill shortage. Everyone talks about a skill shortage. I challenge that. It's a skills challenge. We've got a unprecedented investment in the Australian rail industry through construction all the way through to operations. So we've got an opportunity to invest now in our skills here in Australia. We're a smart country. If we invest now, if we have a national approach to skills management, rail specialist skills, where we can utilise the skills in each organisation across each network, each rail delivery authority, we can develop our own expertise here. We don't need to import any expertise from overseas. We're investing more here than many other countries in the world in our rail infrastructure. So I'm a big advocate of that. We invest in our own team a lot, and having a national approach is critical for that, because rail expertise is such a unique skill set, and unfortunately it doesn't always have the long runway in one specific market. So if we have a national skills approach to competency management, to transfer of skills across Australia, it gives opportunity for each individual that is developing the skills. They've got a career progression that they can continue on their specialist skill. And then I'll come back to procurement. again, a national. We've talked. We're looking with the ARA at doing a national procurement framework and have recommendations. A key one of those recommendations that will support this supply chain blueprint is having pre-qualifications for rail industry companies. The road industry does it well. They've got a national pre-qual for roads and bridges, and financial, where companies can be pre-qualified. And then when tenders come to market, that's the initial selection criteria, as opposed to at the moment, we have to prove each time in every tender, which is cumbersome, and it actually leads to a risk of railways engaging with contractors that don't have the requisite internal skill set to deliver a project effectively and efficiently.
It's true. Thanks, Traven. Rafael, I hope we've sorted out your sound now. I'm really keen to hear from you around a national approach and a harmonised approach to the sector.
Yes, I think, is it better now? Can you hear me?
Right, we can hear you loud and clear.
I think we had a double muting in place on my side, which led to some technical issue. So thanks, Natalie, and thanks. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to be able to talk about this this topic indeed. And I think I'm not going to repeat what let's say my fellow panelist and Adrian has said earlier. But the key is really, yes, a national approach. And I think what was also very interesting from your report, Adrian, is to see that, yes, Australia is today one of the only large country with a sub-national, approach in terms of regulation. But let's face it, I mean, this political situation is not going to change, in a day. I mean, it is there really anchored in the Australia situation, and we have to be able to deal with it. And Siemens also being a European company, I think we have lots of experience. And when you think about it, Europe is also a lot of nations, coming together, and that's over a very long period of time, let's face it, has managed to have a more coordinated approach to the deployment of standards, competency, and technology in Europe. So it is possible, and we should not take, some of our, the setup that we have in Australia as a barrier. But what I can talk about is some of the great initiatives that we have today, like, that the ARA has been championing as well, like iTrace, like Rail Industry Worker, or even RISB, in terms of the standards. What we see at the moment is that there's still a lot of barrier, because there's some great initiatives put in place, but either they are being let's say, hindered by some of the lack of resource, because today, let's face it, and as my colleague have said, there is a clear shortage of resource locally. So what the companies are doing, whether if it's the railway operators, the manufacturing company, is focusing the resource on the urgency, to deliver the project. So this has hindered some of the projects. And the other part, in particular, I'm thinking about the competency topic or about the standards, that there's lots of discussion happening. Good discussion, some agreement are being made. But then when you come back to the reality of what's happened in the various states, is that the state preference are coming back. So there's no magic formula again. We all need to accept the situation, but national coordination and pushing the different railway regulator, the different operator, to come to the party and explaining what's the benefit is really the key.
Yeah, and you made mention of a couple of national programs that have been industry-led. So it's great to see industry sort of taking carriage of some of these issues when we can't sort of influence policy or federation in terms of iTrace and rail industry worker. Michael, what's your view around mandated national standards? There's often a conversation around the lack of take-up by some of the jurisdictions of these national standards and how that causes this fragmentation for industry. Do you have thoughts on that? Michael, you're on mute. Happy for you to all stay off mute until we finish this webinar.
I'm back. Andrew talked a bit about it, but I mean, look, one of the key issues about creating scale is this lack of national standards, and even differences in technical requirements, and also varying procurement approaches. So what we see is efficiency and risk increase as bid increase in bid and engineering costs, manufacturing scale and complexity, but it also goes to maintenance as well. So if you've got varying standards and varying equipment in each of the sub areas in each state, you increase obsolescence problems later on, inventory and component supply side, maintenance scale, test equipment for different maintenance activities, human skills, business complexity. It all becomes a huge problem if we don't standardize some of those standards. And the other thing it does is it may be okay for Siemens or Knorr-Bremse can manage that sort of stuff, but it becomes a really big barrier for the SMEs to comply with different standards across different projects. So I mean, clearly we've got to do work on it. It's a tough problem. It's something we need to work out what our priorities are and come down to the few that make a big difference and try and do that. And I like Andrew's comments about using the metro as the platform to standardise across the country as well. That's clearly the sort of direction we need to take. Yeah.
It seems like a no-brainer. Andrew, from your past lives, can you provide any insight of how we can change in the short, medium term, shift the thinking at a sort of operator level?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was with Adtrans, now then Bombardier, now Alstom, we actually designed a platform for the Metro family, which you can only standardize within the interfaces you can control. I think that's an important thing to understand. So if the railways of each state set the same interface standards where they can, for example, platform height, simple one, but platform height, that gives the manufacturers a very simple benchmark from which they can then design their underframes. Okay, so whether it's a narrow gauge or broad gauge, if you talk about standard voltage, the voltage supply to trains, then you can start to standardize on converters and power supply systems. So I think if there's some top level agreement about we're going to use 23 meter cars, 3 meters wide, platform height of 1100, whatever, and then even you don't even need to address door spacings because platform screen doors these days pretty good, pretty flexible in the design. So you got to set the top level parameters for the network, including, for example, tunnel diameter, and then the engineer, what very clever engineers within the main rolling stock suppliers, and they'll be able to then start producing vehicles that are compatible with a number of different systems in which, and that will reduce costs, reduce time to market, and improve reliability, and give the sub-suppliers, the supply chain to them, the chance to be having some scale. But it starts off at the top level and a will to build an industry on this. We are embarking on metros. We've only had one proper metro built so far. The second one's in construction. There's going to be many, many more. So let's take the chance now to do that standardization of the basic parameters.
It's good practical steps. Thanks, Andrew. Adrian, sorry, I'm not leaving you out. Keen to hear from you in terms of, do we need the Commonwealth Government to be involved to ensure a national approach to coordinate states?
Oh, look, I used to think that, but I could be waiting a very long time if I was just to wait for the Commonwealth Government to make a decision on a lot of things, unfortunately. I really think we have to take the lead a bit ourselves in what we do. I think industry has already made some good efforts with some state governments to try and improve the way we do things and improve some of the standards, improve the way we procure projects. As I said, I really think there's a potential there that we can try and draw other states into that fold and try to develop some coordination at a state level. I'd love to see national government involvement, but I sort of fear that the way the rail industry is itself developed in Australia is a kind of a colony of states, and the way that each colony has got about developing its rail. There seems to be almost an aversion for national governments to want to get involved as much as we would like. I just think I agree with what Andrew was saying about the metros, for instance, and this is happening now. I mean, we would need some pretty quick turnaround at the national level, I think, to see that coordinated lead. I think we've got to work with the state governments to make it work in the real world.
There was a comment from a participant around should we look elsewhere internationally for some lessons learned and good examples, for example, Europe. Has anyone got comments or experience that they can share?
So, sorry, Natalie, is it on a particular topic or in general?
Not just in terms of a national coordinated approach with the different states. I guess Europe is an example of having a Europe standards, European approach with all the different countries amongst them.
Yeah, well, I think what I can talk about is UNISIG, for example, in Europe, which is an entity that has been created to look at a coordinated approach between the states, and the outcome was the development of the we call it ETCS system that we use here also in Australia. So it has been a very long journey, and getting all the states to come together, all the manufacturers to come together and agree on the standards. But it really came to fruition. So I think it's a great example of what can be done in the absence, let's say, of a strong national approach for the country of Australia.
It's interesting that you raised that example, because there was a question that's come through around rail signalling and traffic and telecom, and whether there's a national signalling system discussion and a national train traffic control system. Can you provide any insights there, Rafael? And we'll switch to you, Andrew.
In Australia, no. Today there's no standard. I think RISB is trying to work to define some standards. So for various parts like axle counter or some of the trackside system, but there's no such thing as a national standard. So, for example, all the manufacturers in Australia have to type approve their interlocking, for example, in each of the various states. There's no single central approval for the various technology. But what is true is that once you have approval in a certain state, you can do cross-type approval. So it's not as extensive of what you need to do once you have already the approval in one of the states in Australia.
Mm. Thanks, Rafael. Andrew, you wanted to make an additional
comment? I just wanted to make a comment against the overseas examples. I think as well as the European one that Rahul was talking about, the Chinese government, in a highly coordinated way, cherry-picked a lot of technologies from around the globe, produced 2 standard metro types, and has built extensive metros based on those two standards, and then switched to high speed and done the same thing there. And they have moved faster and more economically in their construction of railways than any other nation. I know they've got huge scale, but they created the scale by saying, this is how we're going to do it. So that's what you can do if you have a highly coordinated national approach. Now, I suspect that in Australia, we'll move faster if the states just talk to each other. And I know that Victoria and New South Wales do that. So, congratulations to them. But it has to happen quickly, because we're committing the expenditure for a decade to come. And we could get more bangs per buck if we move fast on that front.
And if you look at local content, if you think about what they do in the US, where they have a Buy America program, where they mandate about 50%, I think it is, of the product or the subsystems or the rolling stock itself has to be procured or finally assembled in the US when there is national government funding or national grants, federal grants. That creates scale. So I know that, for instance, Knorr-Bremse has a couple of plants in the US which supply projects all over the US, and therefore can create the scale you need for manufacturing. And that's the sort of thing we need to happen. But I'm a bit like Andrew. I don't see the because the feds aren't typically funding the projects anyway. It's going to be difficult for them to intervene. It's going to be necessary for the states to be involved through the NRAP or whatever it happens to be, to try and create local manufacturing of scale that also meets the political ends of each of those state governments as well. So it's
Indeed. Treven, I know type approvals is something that can be quite a frustrating area for industry, not just local content and getting economies of scale, but then trying to apply new technologies and innovation in the supply chain. Have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And our experience is different to Raphael's with rolling stock and maybe signalling technology with infrastructure. So below rail, each rail authority has their own type approval process, and there is no cross type approval. If we have to seek approval with each rail authority, you take Victoria at the moment. There's a number of entities. There's MTM, V-Line, the new rail delivery authorities like LXRP, I should say, Metro Tunnel. They each have their own type approval process, and they're not. Once you gain type approval for a product with one of those railways, which is a long process, there's no guarantee or there's no easy process to use that approval for the next railway. So a national approach for type approval, I suggest if it is approved in one area, then a desktop approval for other areas, because it just hinders innovation. That's either from products from overseas or innovative products here in Australia. We've got an opportunity to develop something that's specifically fit for purpose for the project we're building.
Adrian, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this, because I feel like COVID-19 has created this opportunity in terms of looking at supply chain resilience and how we can do things differently and more innovatively. Could you share some thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that we've been talking about here actually, would be fantastic if we did have a kind of a national framework to base it on, whether you're talking local content or standards, type approvals, and so on. And I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, I'm going to be a bit annoying, and I don't have the perfect solution to this, but I would say that a lot of it stems from the fact that we charge our governments, essentially, potentially our state governments, to try and maximise their local bang for the buck that they get for their rail investments. And I think we've got to break that kind of nexus. They have to think a little bit more broadly than that. I'm not sure if there's a national solution that can come in to assist that, but I would certainly love to see more interest between governments at coordinating their investment decisions and looking at sharing the benefits of those decisions, rather than treating rail as a kind of a competitive football where we try and just lock in as many great returns as we can for companies in one state and then put up a wall to companies in others. One thing that we've discovered but know when we look at the rail industry is that we've got all these fantastic capabilities, but they're all located everywhere throughout Australia, and we'll never get the scale we need if we just don't get state governments coordinating on those sorts of policies, whether it be local content, type approvals, and so on. So we really need to bring them to a table where we can nut out those differences and work out what will work that will give us that more national perspective with your state infrastructure spend.
And we're often dictated in terms of, with a lot of rail companies being part of multinational companies, in terms of international standards or international technologies. how important is it for a business as part of the local supply chain to be engaged with an international supply chain? Michael, I might throw to you first.
Yeah, well, I think if a local business can be engaged with an international player, it also can give them scale, of course. So I think that's very important, and it also brings them some funds to do the work they need to do. So if possible, either they need to be engaged in some sort of partnership, or maybe even an international firm buys a local company like Kenora has done in Australia on a couple of occasions. And so, for instance, in the case of Sigma, who we purchased, we now, well, they already had a good export business, but through our distribution chain and our manufacturing capabilities overseas, we're exporting to Riyadh, to Doha, to Dhaka, to Vancouver, Miami, Chicago, Baltimore, many different projects around the world. So again, that brings some scale that maybe the local market doesn't have. So yeah, if that's possible, then that's certainly you know, a route for smaller local SMEs in Australia, if they can identify it. Otherwise, it takes a lot of shoe leather to realise those export opportunities. Some have done it for sure, but partnering or being part of a global distribution channel helps a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that the investment is going to be twice as much in rail than it has been in the mining boom. So dealing with the fact that we have skills challenges, Raphael, how important is innovation and technology to address some of these significant opportunities that exist for the Australian rail industry?
Yes, Natalie, I think it's a very good question, because indeed there is this shortage of resource, but technology can help with some of them, not everything. I mean, we have to manage this shortage of resource and make it easier for also overseas resource to be able to come and work in Australia. But now let's focus on technology and what can happen. I think there's two. I would split the kind of innovation in two in these questions. First, there's all the new technology that you can apply with the delivery of a project. And here we're talking about tools, to accelerate the work and automate a lot of activity. And giving an example, everything linked to software, when we prepare data work, when you have tools, and Siemens, and it's valid for most of the technology company, is implementing tools to quicken the process of developing a lot of the data work. And there's also, and I think COVID has taught us a lot of lessons here, all the stream of work to do remote commissionings. Remote commissioning is a very important part also of dealing with the shortage of resource, because you don't need to fly your resource around, and they are more efficient. So the stream of work around innovation and doing remote commissioning is also extremely important to be able to ramp up the kind of work that you can do. Then there's the second stream, which is innovation in stuff, in the technology and the solutions that you are deploying. And what we see, let's say, our vision in the future with digitalization is that in terms of signaling, for example, is that you will have almost a virtual signaling environment. So you will still have the trackside equipment, because when you have track, you need points to move them, or some track detection, or some but all the rest after is going to be virtual. And we have already some innovation in Europe that we have deployed in Austria, for example, where we have put our digital platform on off-the-shelf equipment. So it's the first interlocking that you do with completely standard COTS equipment. And what it means is the start of the virtualization of the signaling system. And what it means in the future is that you're interlocking, rather than being in the track very far away, where again you need to move your all your engineers, or even the personnel from the operator. They will be able to be tomorrow in the control center where everyone is, and it will make the commissioning and the implementation of the new projects much easier. So this stream of work also and introducing new innovation in the solution that we are deploying. To deploy it the first time, and we talked about the barrier to innovation, it's going to be a challenge because you need to go through a very long type approval process. But once it's type approved, then it's going to quicken really the implementation of all those projects.
Yeah. We have covered so many areas of challenges today in our discussion, and it's certainly highlighted in the report, some of which have been around with us for years, decades. There's been a few comments where industry is really good at chatting about this stuff, putting it into practice and making changes the hard part. And whilst I alluded to before around the blueprint that we're developing around some practical priorities, I'm really keen for each of you today to give us your first, I guess, final comments on what are those key first steps that we really need to make in the short term to kickstart this significant work that we have in front of us. Shall we start with you, Adrian?
Why not? I've already sort of said some areas where I think we've got some opportunities. And I must say, what people have said here today, I'd really love work to proceed quickly on some of those as well, because, geez, I wish we had some of that virtual stuff during the midst of the COVID, where we could be using those technologies a lot sooner. But anyway, we'll make the best of them when they come along. But look, whether it be amongst procurement, whether it be amongst trying to achieve better standards and consistency, I think what we really need to do is to just bring more state governments on board, and we need to start assigning almost like a responsibility on states to, this is how we're going to want to work this with you as an industry. There's benefits in it for them. Imagine all the benefits that we can get from the metros, as Andrew's pointed out, if we can standardise a lot of this stuff. I mean, we'll end up saving the taxpayer millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, in the way that we roll these projects out. And that's, that comes back to me to about fundamental performance, about productivity. When you look at our entire construction industry, it's not a great story. And here we are in rail, about to embark on a big investment program that we'd like to see sustained well into the future. Well, we've got to set it up in a way that it's going to be productive and efficient. And we really need to get state governments talking to each other about these very issues so that we can make some progress.
Thank you, Adrian. Treven, where's the greatest need? Where do we start?
Yeah, definitely having a focus. So there, I think it was 30 plus findings, and in 9 different areas. If we as a group can come together and have a smaller handful of focus areas, for the rail contracting, it's definitely the procurement and skills need to be the focus, ensuring that we're investing in skills to meet this investment, and also the procurement, making sure the procurement sets it up for success. Because at the procurement phase, that's where a lot of these decisions are made. As soon as it's with a supplier or a contractor, the decision's already made prior to that. So
yeah,
that's those 2 areas.
Thanks, Treven. Raphael?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So for me, if I have to say one, the first one we have to fix is the resource shortages, because for all the great actions that Adrian has listed, you need people, and you need people to dedicate time, on those programs. And until we have this very steep shortage that we have in Australia, I think it will be very difficult for all the stakeholders in the industry to dedicate resource to work on those programs. So for me, it's shortage of resource and all the competency topic that we talk about. So having some standardization around the competency will help also the shortage of the resource.
Thanks. And Michael?
For me, the key thing that would immediately help is this transparency and stability around the project cycle at the moment. It's really hard to plan in this industry at the moment, and there's a lot of start-stop even within projects, and that causes skills problems for us, causes capacity issues, all sorts of productivity problems and the like. So that's the first one for me. I think the standardisation thing is the next one, and what Trevin said, we need to pick 5 or 6 or 7 big hitters or jumping off points that Andrew talked about, and really focus on getting those standard, those heavy hitter standardisation things done and underway. And the last thing I think we need to start, it's probably not going to help in the short term, but we need to start with our ability to develop technology, R&D, and the like. So we really need to think about how we do that in Australia, how it gets funded, and what are the mechanisms and processes to do that.
Thanks, and Michael. Andrew, you get the final comment.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everybody for inviting me on here. Thanks. Look, I think there's 3 things we've got to do, Natalie. Got a good report now. The ARA has got the best people sitting around its board table these days, and access into the states. And I think the ARA, supported by the National Transport Committee, TIC and whatever, you should really be pushing to get the standardizations going on metro straight away. That we should be looking for, as ARA again, as for a federal advocate to be able to help us really get some skills development going. We've tried several times and it's never really got very far. And to also, and we've not touched on this, but it's something that I thought I'd like to leave you with. Every time we tried to get high speed rail going in this country, the airline lobby has done well to put us down, and we've not managed to get through that. Well, their lobby arguments are currently very weak, and we ought to be embarking on a high speed program. And I think that's the other thing that will give us tremendous long-term supply chain security when we've got a nation building project going on like that.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Well, that brings us to the end of the launch of the research report and our panel discussion today. A huge thank you to our presenter, Adrian, and all of our panelists, Michael, Rafael, Trevin, and Andrew. So for all of those participating, the supply chain report and associated fact sheets and case studies are now available on the ARA website, and we will also be sharing our recording of today's discussion soon. I really hope you found today's event informative. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but I really hope that you enjoyed today's session, and thanks for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon. See you later.